Welcome back to Beyond Well. I'm Sheila Hamilton, and this is a program for people who want to learn more about our interior lives. And for decades, families have often been seen as part of the problem when a loved one is in psychiatric crisis. Parents and relatives are sometimes blamed implicitly or otherwise for their child's or their family members' distress. But many clinicians and researchers are now rethinking that narrative, recognizing the way that systems, stress, biology all play a role, and that families can be essential allies in healing. Today, we're talking with two leaders who have each worked to reshape how we think about collaboration and compassion in psychiatric care. Dr. Stuart Ablon is director of Think Kids at Massachusetts General and a leading voice in collaborative problem solving. He's focused on moving people from blame to understanding how we approach challenging behaviors. Welcome, Stuart. It's so good to see you.
Nice to see you again, Sheila, and glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
And Dr. John Puls is a psychotherapist and clinical director with extensive experience in inpatient and family-centered treatment. He's written and spoken about systemic change in psychiatric care and how clinicians can better partner with families rather than pathologizing them. John, it's great to have you on the show again.
Hi, Sheila. Thanks again for having me.
So today we're going to explore the roots of family blaming, why it happens. I think anybody who has had a family member in psychiatric care is going to be interested in this topic and what a more collaborative, compassionate approach might look like. So both of you, I'd just like to begin with this idea that families have been blamed for mental health problems for so long. It's like historical when you start reading about it. Why does this kind of family blaming persist? And I'll start with you, Dr. Ablon.
Sure. Look, I think conventional wisdom dies hard. And, there's, as you mentioned, a long, long history of people blaming really not just family, but parents. And if we're really being accurate here, historically, moms. As a dad of three myself, I always say we've made progress now where dads matter. So, now we can be blamed too. But it didn't always used to be the case. It was
Yeah.
really moms that were primarily blamed. And you go back to concepts like the schizophrenic mother,
Yeah.
the thought that like cold, unempathic moms cause schizophrenia, which we know is like now is absurd, right? But honestly, even more recently, in my professional lifetime, we had a term we used to refer to refrigerator mothers,
Oh,
and
wow.
refrigerator mothers were thought to cause autism. And, thank goodness now we realize what nonsense that was. And that, for instance, autism spectrum disorders are complicated neurodevelopmental difficulties.
Right.
And by the way, it's really hard to parent a child who has some of these challenges, which makes it difficult for families. So bottom line, there's a long history, and it takes us a while to sort of catch up with what we've learned, what we now know, and to believe and act differently. And I think that's the place we're at right now.
And John, do you have anything to add just about the number of families that you've seen when you're working, especially with young men who are in crisis? Is this still a consistent pattern that you're recognizing?
Absolutely still a consistent pattern. Stuart, when you said, old ideas die hard, and in this case, I think sometimes they don't die at all, right? And and I absolutely see this, whether it is a more significant or persistent mental health issue, certainly see it in the addiction treatment world where families are blamed and pathologized. And I think really it's a lack of understanding and sometimes laziness on the part of providers, without condemning them, that they, rather than take a more comprehensive look at the whole picture, it's easier to blame the parents. And I absolutely agree that moms are much more frequently blamed,
Mm.
really just due to societal norms, as mothers being the primary caregivers. And without a doubt, this is the perception that I think a lot of providers, and certainly non-providers as well, have, that the parents must have done something to cause this, and therefore or are contributing to it. When in reality, what parents and mothers specifically are doing are trying to love their kids under really difficult circumstances.
I've been really shocked in seeing it in a clinical setting where the more people who can be cooperating, helping the patient toward health, the more people that can be collaborating could not be a bad thing. Why are we segmenting off some of the best potential support
Right.
for that patient and blaming them? Stuart?
Well, I think you're making a great point, Sheila, is, the more all hands on deck,
Yes. Yeah.
and the more people who can be helpful. But, when we cast blame, we sort of ostracize some member of the team. And here we're talking a lot about blaming families and parents, but, it also works the other way around where, for instance, educators get blamed for
Yes.
things as well. And it makes it really hard for families and teachers to collaborate around what's in the best interest of the kid. And the other person who gets blamed are the children themselves, right? So, and frankly, I think most of this blame comes back to the fact that it's really hard dealing with complicated mental health struggles. And
Right.
it's really upsetting. At times, it's incredibly worrisome. As a parent, it's scary. And when you're anxious, worried, upset, scared, don't know what to do, it's human nature that we sort of, we reach for power and control, and we try to sort of point the finger at other people when
Yeah.
we get dysregulated. And
Yeah.
but the blame game, you're saying it well, Sheila. It doesn't serve anyone, and
Yeah.
it's something we need to get away from. But the only way we get away from that is by having more accurate understandings of difficulties that don't throw anybody under the bus.
Yeah. So, what would you like to see, John, when one of your patients goes through an inpatient psychiatric experience? What would you like to see to move from this clinical culture of blame and control towards something that's more empathetic, something that's more nuanced, something that's way more collaborative?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with actually where I think some of this comes from, and then what I'd like to see alternatively, which I think there was this massive movement. It's a codependency movement, is what we've called it, right? Where I think, and a lot of it's stemmed from modern addiction treatment. And Melody Beattie released this great book that helped a lot of people. But I think what ended up coming from that is a lot of pathologizing of family members and kind of this like idea of separating them and pathologizing love, right? Pathologizing concern and care, what is really natural parenting. So
Yeah.
when somebody goes through an inpatient psychiatric setting, I'll quote Dr. Robert Weiss with his idea of prodependency, right? So this idea that really to like bring the family or whoever are the other stakeholders involved in someone's care into the care collaboratively to work together, as opposed to in a separate silo and people being blamed for enabling or
Mm-hmm.
codependency, and they're making the problem worse, or all types of terrible things. You're making your kids sick. The reality is, especially in inpatient treatment, you have the ability to work with this person for such a short period of time,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's a crisis unit or even in like a longer term residential stay, you're still only there for a short period of time. That patient is going to be with their family, their system, the other stakeholders involved in their care for much longer, right? So why would you ever want to like create a wedge in the system when you're not going to be in the picture pretty soon? Right.
Yeah.
And it's just crazy, because then you've developed this wedge into the system instead of trying to bring the family closer together. So it's a long way of me saying what I would like to see is family brought into the treatment planning, other stakeholders brought into the treatment planning, it being done collaboratively, there being an agreement upon it, them getting education and support and guidance, as opposed to things being separated.
I have,
John, can I just
yeah, go
say,
ahead, Stuart.
I think,
Yeah.
John, you're making such an important point here. And, we do a lot of work in therapeutic settings like inpatient hospitals, inpatient units, but also residential treatment facilities. And, the return to those facilities, the churn rate is so high. And one of the reasons is when we ignore the family culture and the
Mm.
family piece of things, and we just think we're trying to fix the problem in residential treatment and then send the child back out into the world. No, we need to invite the family, the caregivers, into that process, and it needs to be a collaborative process while we have the child. And that's really sort of the missing link. So I think you're hitting on something so critical there, John.
This just occurred to me, Stuart, because I'm getting my master's degree in creative writing at Harvard. So I'll probably see you sometime on campus. And in storytelling, people are always looking for who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist. Like, what is the end of the story? How did we get there? Who caused that ripple effect of things to occur? And in some ways, psychiatric illness just defies regular storytelling because it is so much a product of our brain chemistry, our upbringing, our traumas, our drug use. Or, I mean, it is such a multi-complex
Yes.
thing. Is it even possible to hope that we could get rid of family blaming because it is so convenient?
I think so. Look, there were times when we used to blame parents for things that we no longer do. So I have
Okay.
hope. And there were a couple examples. I don't think anybody blames moms for being too cold and causing their child to have autism today. I don't think that
Uh-huh.
happens anymore.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, we used to blame parents for kids' reading disabilities and things like that. So,
Yeah.
I think it is possible to make that progress. But I think you also make a very good point that when it comes to mental health challenges, it's complicated. It's not a straight line. Things don't make sense. As much as we try to tell a story and try to understand, why did this person have this depressive episode at this point? Sometimes we really don't know. And
Yeah.
that's uncertainty is really hard for us to tolerate. So we try to tell ourselves a story. We try to build something. And yes, we often, look for where we can place blame. And I guess one thing I would add in that area is, we may not like how somebody is behaving. We may even think that how they're behaving is has something to do with, how a child is doing, but that doesn't mean that we need to blame them.
Right.
It means that we have to understand what's going on. There's reasons why they're behaving that way. I always say to myself, I may not like somebody's behavior, but I'm sure they have a good reason for it.
That's a
And
really
my
good
job
thing.
is to
Yeah.
try to figure out what is their good reason for it and to understand that. And then we can build bridges and collaboration.
Yeah. John, you have worked in hospital and residential settings where families will report feeling shut out. This is particularly interesting when it happens to a young adult. So they are old enough to make their own decisions, but don't have the prefrontal cortex or any of the wiring to actually make good decisions, especially if they have anosognosia or a lack of awareness about their situation. So how can you, as perhaps the person who either referred the person to inpatient or the person who's been treating that person, help smooth the system so that people understand the complexity of the family dynamic and actually help create this collaborative problem-solving model?
Yeah, so it definitely gets more complicated when they're young adults, right? When they're of age, they're able to, they're not under guardianship or anything like that. They're able to consent to their own treatment. They're able to prevent or allow certain information from being transmitted from these facilities. So it definitely adds a layer of complexity. Unfortunately, HIPAA is often, a barrier, right,
Yeah.
to families being involved in care. The distinction I would make is that the good facilities, good programs, the ones that I think that understand what we're talking about today will really make a concerted effort to involve the family, as opposed to just saying, well, they're an adult and they don't want us talking to their parents, so that's a wrap, right?
Mm.
And then 30 days go by, 60 days go by, and there's no real effort made to intervene. Um, People change their minds. And so I would seek, I would encourage the facility or the referring clinician to really seek to understand, why are you trying to shut out your family? What are some of the issues? Is there something that we can address with them? One of the things I always try to say to, clients that maybe don't want their family involved, I'm like, listen, this is not just for you. This is to help you with your family as well, so that
Yeah.
hopefully, there could be some dynamic changes. But it is a lot harder. I just try to work with programs that I know are going to make that extra effort to keep family involved, because it's so critically important. Because if they're not talking during this very short-term treatment stay, they're going to end up talking when they leave,
Yeah.
right? And then again, the family has no idea what's going on. They can't possibly help, and it's really important. And so, I would just encourage a lot of providers to try and work through that.
Stuart, John makes such a great point about HIPAA. Is there any model to actually flex HIPAA to be more collaborative, more helpful to all of the people involved?
Not that I'm aware of,
Oh,
but here's the thing. It's interesting when you think about care of somebody my age, for instance. It is equally important to involve the family and the support system of somebody middle-aged, older, you name it. It's just sort of it's at that tricky transition point that John is naming there, where it sort of takes extra weight because as a parent, I'm used to having information, right?
yeah,
And all
right.
of a sudden, I don't have information anymore. And that's very unsettling. I remember the first time with my first child going to college, and you're allowed to pay all the bills, but you aren't allowed to know whether they're going to class or,
Hey, hold on.
anything like
Didn't
that.
all of us send kids to camp and we couldn't contact our children? And we're like,
Yeah,
wait, I
yeah,
just need.
it's very unsettling, right? And it sort of dysregulates us.
Yeah.
So I think the issue is true across the lifespan. And yet I think as John's pointing out, there are ways to respect confidentiality and encourage collaboration. And if it's done the right way, the patient will be more open to the sharing of information and communication in a way that's going to be helpful for them.
John, what do you wish that more practitioners understood about the toll that families are carrying and how that actually shapes their interaction, the level of stress that they've endured, perhaps physical assault, whatever it is that the conditions are that actually lead them to either referring their kids to inpatient or referring their loved one to inpatient? It seems to me that the families are often not really considered, but they've gone through their own psychiatric toll.
Oh, yeah. I mean, without a doubt. So I frequently am talking with parents, more often mothers, because of just the dynamic of the relationship, but plenty of dads as well that are hysterical, right?
Yeah.
They are yelling, crying, screaming on the phone, and then invariably they'll apologize to me, and I say, like, don't apologize. You come by this honesty, honestly, right? Like, where you're like upset, frantic, angry, yelling, crying. I mean, it's so hard to describe what it's like. I also have three kids. They're little, so 7, 5, and 3. So people always say, little kids, little problems, but it's hard to describe what a parent goes through with the parents that I've spoken to when their kid is constantly in crisis,
Mm.
right? In and out of, could be a psychotic episode, substance use crisis, severe and persistent depression, the stress and toll that causes on someone's nervous system, their psychiatric, condition in general, and it just causes such severe and profound trauma that, of course, they're not going to interact in a standard way with various providers that they speak to. And I mean, it would be crazy to think otherwise, right? That, like, of course, they're not going to be, totally with it at the time. And so I think what providers have to understand is that while the patient in front of them may be the child, adolescent, young adult, the parents that have been trying to love them under really difficult circumstances and caretaking for them have gone through an enormous amount of trauma, heartache, pain. And so it's just important to understand that that's where they're coming from as well, and not to view that through some like negative pathologizing lens, but rather to normalize that and
Yes.
understand that that would be a reaction to any parent that was
And
going through something like
yeah, and
that.
John, I think the other thing about this is like this, if your child is experiencing some really significant, potentially life-threatening medical issue, all of the things you just said are entirely true. But then when it comes to mental health, you add on this layer of how complicated it is to navigate the system,
Yep.
to know what the options are, to have any idea of sort of what direction to turn in. It's just a whole nother level of unsettling. And so I think it is incredibly traumatic and distressing to families. And so, look, we shouldn't expect also us parents to be at our best in moments like that. And in our work, we have this saying, kids do well if they can. Well, guess what? Parents do well if they can
Mm.
also. And parents do the best they can to handle extraordinarily challenging circumstances like this.
Today, we're talking with two of my favorite voices in the entire mental health field about how we might work to reshape how we think about collaboration and compassion in psychiatric care. We've got Dr. Stuart Ablon from Think Kids at Massachusetts General and a leading voice in collaborative problem solving, and Dr. John Puls, a psychotherapist and clinical director with extensive experience in inpatient treatment. When we come back, we're going to be talking much more about the collaborative problem solving method and how it can help you in just everyday family mode. It's something I'm super excited about, and I hope you'll join us.